All right, so I want to begin by thanking you for being part of this series on racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. As together we have explored our country's history, much of which we didn't know. As we have seen during our time together, much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of our history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes we hear or even hold ourselves are a direct consequence of intentional public and economic policy and biased beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Now that we more deeply understand the history of our country and the myriad ways that bigotry and discrimination are embedded in our society, we turn our attention to the pivotal question, so what are we going to do about it? We have seen much about our country's history in these weeks together that cry out for action, for reform. Much of the historic economic discrimination will take decades or longer to address in comprehensive ways. But we have it within our ability to take meaningful action on issues of criminal justice and voting rights reform, alleviating poverty, and addressing inequity in education. It is essential that we do so, that we make our voices heard, so that others long silenced may be heard as well. And there is another action that is less concrete, but equally important. One that addresses our personal beliefs that are based on our individual histories, our families, our education, our experiences. Examining those beliefs, servicing what is called unconscious bias, implicit bias, is an important step in our ability to identify and counter racism in its many manifestations. Our class this evening will take what we have learned and use it as a catalyst for action. I have some thoughts to share with you this evening, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives as we engage in a meaningful path forward to a more just and equitable society. Together, we will look ahead to use our deeper understanding of our country's history to shape our future actions, as indeed we seek justice and peace for all. So as our custom, we begin with a brief recap of our class last week on voter suppression then and now. We began by looking at the legal history of voting rights in our country, beginning with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution and its various amendments, various legislative acts, and Supreme Court decisions that shape the way voting works or doesn't. We looked at the 15th Amendment that was ratified at the end of Reconstruction, declaring that the right to vote could not be abridged on account of race, color, or condition of previous servitude. And yet the passage of that critical constitutional amendment was followed by 100 years of voter suppression tactics directed at African Americans in our country. That came to much of an end with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ushered in equity in voting, in large part for the first time enabling African American women to vote, despite the fact that the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920 declared that women had the right to vote. In reality, it was not until 1965 that African American women claimed that right. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 held sway for almost 50 years, only 50 years, until the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder that gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and ushered in a wave of efforts designed ostensibly to prevent voter fraud, but voter fraud was never really the fundamental issue. And so as a consequence, we saw the passage of draconian voter ID laws, voting roll purges, the limitation of resources to minority precincts. And indeed, in recent years, 2016, 2020, 2022, the assault on voting rights has accelerated. Indeed, only this week, the state of Texas legislature passed legislation designed to dramatically restrict voting opportunities in Harris County, which encompasses Houston, Texas, and is home to the largest population of African Americans in the state. And every week, it seems, there is another action designed to that end. As we step back and take a look at this class series, we began with the early years from 1619 to 1865. Then we moved to a time period labeled slavery by another name that encompassed the period of Reconstruction, the passage of discriminatory laws known as Black Codes, and the convict leasing that took place as a result, to be followed by public chain gangs and the unpaid work of prisoners to this day. And then Jim Crow laws that focused on segregation in every aspect of public life in our country. Laws that were enforced by violence. As we moved into the 20th century, we looked at some key aspects of public policy and the civil rights movement. Public policy by way of the Federal Housing Administration, the Social Security Act, and the GI Bill. Then we looked from the 1970s forward into the war on drugs and the ways in which it has contributed to mass incarceration in our country, home to less than 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Last week, we looked at tactics for voter suppression from the beginning up until the current day and beyond. And so this evening, we step back, look at what we've learned and say, where do we go from here? What can we do? What should we do? How do we go about it? So to revisit some definitions from our first class, prejudice is an unfavorable opinion formed beforehand or without personal knowledge. And this is where the legacy of segregation is so dramatic in our country, because as Black and white people were required to live separately, to operate separately within society, we lost the ability to get to know one another as fellow human beings. And so what rushes in to fill the knowledge gap are stereotypes and stories that we hear, not what we experience. White supremacy, intentional and punitive throughout our history, is the belief that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial groups, especially Black people, and are therefore rightfully the dominant group in every society. And we see evidence of this throughout our history and clearly in attitudes and opinions that are prevalent today. Racism is discrimination directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial group, typically one that is minority. And it is not just personal beliefs or personal statements. Racism is indeed a system of prejudice backed by power. And so what we have seen is white power exercised throughout our country's history. So that's where we've been. Now we shift our attention from history to the future, to test and to use our deeper understanding of the past to shape our future actions. And so we ask ourselves, in the course of these 5 weeks, what have we learned? Knowing this new information, how are we impacted by it? How are we different? What do we see differently than we did before? If we now see a pattern of white supremacy, of discrimination, then what do we need to do about it, individually and collectively? And based on the breadth and depth of this discrimination, do we feel a new urgency to act, to correct the inequities of our past that continue to today? So what have we learned? We learned that slavery from 1619, 1640 to 1865 created and sustained an underclass of people. And it necessitated a belief in Black inferiority in order to continue. And at the end of the Civil War and the passage of the associated constitutional amendments, the institution of slavery ended, but the belief in Black inferiority did not. We see that all of the actions taken to promote segregation as law, think about it, segregation as law until 1964, has created a legacy that remains to today and is hugely significant. It embodied and it perpetuated white supremacy. We have seen how the passage of intentional public policy systematically disadvantaged Black people in housing, in education, in benefits, in jobs, in criminal justice, in voting. And so as a consequence, the roots of today's inequality are deeply embedded in our country. So how does knowing this history affect us? There is so much that we never knew or fully comprehended. And we need to ask ourselves, why not? Why did we not know this? Why were we not taught this? We observe the isolation from one another, Black from white, a legacy of segregation in all social aspects of life, and especially in the area of housing, where we are not neighbors, where we are not community members, where we are not personal friends. A recent study showed that 75% of adult white Americans do not have a single Black friend. So where is the human connection, the knowing of one another, the sharing of like circumstances, hopes, dreams, difficulties? And that isolation has led to a lack of understanding and a lack of empathy for white people to understand in any meaningful way what it is to be Black in America. And if there is no personal knowledge, then what fills the vacuum are stereotypes, a consequence of both overt and subliminal messaging, intensified by the media. I may have mentioned that I took a class offered by DuPont 40 years ago. I will reference it again. It was entitled Developing Effective Black-White Relationships. It was targeted at 20 white managers. And there were 2 Black DuPonters from Southern plants who participated in the class, which was facilitated by 2 Black men from San Francisco. And the facilitators explained that the 2 Black employees were there so that as the facilitators tried to describe the nature of race and racism and discrimination in America and in American corporations, the tendency of the white managers would be to say, not in DuPont. And where appropriate, the Black employees were to say, well, yes, in DuPont. And I will never forget one of those people speaking up to relate that the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan held its monthly organizing meetings in the conference room at the DuPont plant at the invitation of the plant manager. The facilitators wanted to make clear to those of us who were white, who would have a tendency to feel defensive and denying the reality of this discrimination. And what they said with deep conviction is that you cannot have grown up in the United States of America in the 20th century and not be prejudiced. It is not possible. Consciously, vocally, we may articulate particular beliefs and statements, but we have been inundated by messaging that reinforces the idea of Black inferiority, of white supremacy, of the rightful place of white and Black people in our society. Here's a data point. Won't ask you to read the bar charts, I'm not sure you can, but what it is 3 categories of crimes from left to right: murder, theft, and assault. The blue bar in each case is the percentage of suspects arrested for those crimes who are African American. Now, bear in mind, we know from our class on mass incarceration in the criminal justice system that a disproportionate number of Black people are stopped and arrested for various crimes. So taking that into account, these are the numbers of African Americans arrested, probably significantly or somewhat higher than those who actually committed the crimes, but be that as it may. In the case of murder, 54% of the suspects arrested for murder were African American, 55% of those arrested for theft were African American, and 49% of those arrested for assault were African American. But if you were to look at media reports of these crimes, you would see that African Americans were represented in media reports for 74% of the reports of murders, 84% of the reports of theft, and 73% of the reports of assault. So the numbers of actual arrests already overstated in the context of the race of those suspected of a crime. Nearly half again as many were the ones reflected in media reports of crimes. Nobody said anything about it. You see the TV news, you see the newspaper reports, you don't do the calculation, you don't determine the data, but this is what we are being told. This is what we are seeing. This is a really instructive image capture of 2 screens from the same news report on March 23rd, 2015. On the left, you see a news report that 3 University of Iowa wrestlers were arrested on a charge of burglary. They look pretty responsible. clean cut, dressed in a suit, wearing a tie, could live next door. Later in the same news broadcast, Coralville police arrested 4 in a burglary investigation. Those Black men do not portray the same image at all. And yet that is the unspoken message with which we are confronted. And it happens again and again and again. So there is a point at which these stereotypes flourish, and what develops as a result of all of this messaging is something called unconscious bias or implicit bias. It is a reaction that is automatic, it is unintentional, it doesn't even engage our conscious thinking. When we see an image, when we hear a story, the automatic association that we make is frequently the result of implicit bias. This class that I took was life-changing for me. As I said, there were 20 white managers, DuPont managers, 2 Black plant employees, and 2 African-American facilitators. And the facilitators began the class by saying to the white managers, all look like deer in the headlights. Why have we been selected for this class? Is it because we need the education and the training the most? Is it because we might be inclined to accept it? Why are we here? But setting that aside, the facilitator said to us, okay, we're going to begin. We're going to ask you to relate for us every term, every word, every phrase that you associate with African Americans. And there was a prolonged period of silence when one brave white person spoke up and said, exotic. Okay. So they wrote exotic. And a little more of a delay, and somebody said athletic. Athletic, right, okay. Athletic. Musical. Okay, musical. Jazz. Jazz. Nobody said rhythm, but it was clearly on people's minds. But anyway. And the flow of words trailed off to nothing. Whereupon the facilitator said, oh, sorry, we didn't give you the full and accurate instructions for what we were looking for. We weren't asking you, what do you think? We're asking you, what have you heard? And we filled 11 chart pad pages with words like criminal, welfare, rapist, thief, cheater, handout, 11 chart pad pages. And they hung each of them around the room. And when we ran out of words that we'd heard, they said to the 2 African Americans, okay, so what words do you associate with white people? And they said entitled, privileged, condescending, think they should run everything. Filled a page. And they put the page up on the wall. And I'm looking at those 11 chart pad pages, thinking, what must it be like as a Black person to leave your home every day, knowing that some or most of the people you encounter think those things about you. I have a friend now who is an extraordinary human being, has done amazing work in this field. He's now 80 years old. He lives in Greenville, South Carolina. And he says that there are days that he cannot bring himself to leave his house. He doesn't know who will say it or who will do it, but someone will. point out that he isn't worthy, that he doesn't belong, that he can't be trusted. And so he chooses to stay home because he can't bear what he'll encounter. Never in his life has he gone out for coffee on a Saturday morning in cargo shorts and a hoodie. He dresses in chinos and a polo shirt. He dresses up to go to the grocery store so that he does not confirm the view that people already hold of him. It's my belief, and it's backed up by any number of studies, that in general, white people in America are presumed to be competent until they prove that they're not. And conversely, Black people are presumed not to be competent until they prove that they are. And we have seen this. There have been studies done where organizations took identical resumes and everything about them was the same: where they went to school, what they studied, what their work history was. But at the top of one, they put an American sounding, a white sounding name. And at the top of the other, they put a Black sounding name. And there was a 50% difference in the callbacks from this initial resume. They'd never met the person. They didn't know anything about them other than these details. But the African sounding name meant a 50% reduced volume in callbacks to apply for a job. There is a test, and I would encourage all of us to take it. It is offered by Harvard University. It can be found at implicit.harvard.edu/implicit. And it is designed to test each of our individual implicit bias. And in my experience, it is a stunningly revealing test. And I encourage each of you to take it and reflect on the results that you see. If you're really brave and you really trust one another, you might want to get together as a group and talk about what that implicit bias test has said about, in essence, the messages you've absorbed. It's not about, are we good people or bad people? It is simply about what have we taken in without ever even realizing it. And it helps give us a base point for education and action and growth. And so all of this requires each of us taking personal responsibility for our beliefs, our behaviors, our actions, and especially for the white people who are in this group, to confront and acknowledge the messaging we've received and how it has embedded itself in our attitudes and our opinions, and ultimately in our actions. And there is enormous opportunity for growth. So what's next? For those of us in a community of faith, prayer is always at the heart of what we do. How might we ask God's help to become fairer, more caring, more just, more engaged servants of God? And self-examination is a key part of the work to be done. So, to all the white people here, myself included, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay. In fact, it's necessary. It's growth. It's not easy to assess attitudes and behaviors that remain largely hidden to us because they've developed without our conscious thought or awareness. One of the things that can play an important role is continuing education and dialogue. Groups like this, sharing our thoughts, asking questions, developing better knowledge, and listening, not to clarify, not to refute, but to understand, to hear someone else's lived experience that is different from our own. And then understanding more, seeing the issues more clearly, what action could we take? What needs to be done? And then, so what could I do? And then making a personal commitment to say, this is what I will do. So in the area of self-examination, it applies to all of us, but particularly in this context to white people. Observing ourselves in situations where race is an element, race is a factor, whether it's the people we're surrounded by, the issue that we're addressing, the topic being discussed, stepping outside and observing and reflecting on what are we thinking and how are we feeling in this situation? And being self-aware enough to monitor our reactions to a circumstance. I have been doing this work for 40 years, and I like to think that I've made some progress, but I haven't been able to erase the past. And about 3 years ago, my husband and I were with another couple in Washington, D.C. We were spending the Columbus Day weekend there. And we were getting ready to come home when we got a call from our neighbor that a tree, a 100-foot pine tree, had fallen on our house. And it had done some significant damage to the roof. It had crashed through, damaged the ceiling, the water damage. Anyway, when we got home and looked at it and contacted insurance and worker people, we realized that the way the tree had fallen and kind of interwoven itself with deck railings and all the rest, that it was entirely possible that in removing the tree, more damage might be done that had been caused by the original crash. And when the workers came, I sat in the living room where I got a pretty good view of the work that was going on, when suddenly there was this tremendous crash and the whole house shook. And I looked up and I saw that the crew chief was white, and I felt better. Not a single conscious thought, just a reaction based on who I am, what I've heard, what I believe. But recognizing that response for what it was made it possible to think it through and to reshape my response and to consider the implications and the alternatives. Now, in order to do this self-examination, the self piece is really kind of misleading. It's really helpful to have a partner, somebody that you know, somebody that you trust, somebody, if they say to you, you know, so that was really a sketchy thing you just said, is the most helpful, particularly if you can say it back, because you know you're working together for growth and for learning and for experience. In terms of continuing education, there are a gazillion books, videos, articles, museums. I'm thrilled to pieces that you're thinking of going to the museum in Montgomery. The other one that is extraordinary is the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C. I've been twice. I've spent a half a day there each time, and there is still so much more to learn from that museum. Classes and discussion groups can be enormously helpful. I'll send you a list, and I would suggest that you use it as a starting point and add your own recommended books that have been helpful to me, to you, in expanding our awareness and our education. For white people, the book and the video by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility is revelatory in terms of who we are, what we've learned, what we think. The Warmth of Others' Suns is a marvelous book by Isabel Wilkerson on the Great Migration. And her book Caste describes the hierarchical system that was created centuries ago and continues to exist in our country, and the way that it plays out throughout the course of our interactions with one another. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein covers many of the topics we discussed in the class on public policy, but goes much further to explain the ways in which discrimination has been embedded in our legal system. And The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, she said she wrote it when she asked herself the question, why can't we have nice things? And it is this dichotomy between Black and white and the actions that have been taken that set white against Black people. Her seminal image concept are the municipal public swimming pools of the late 1940s and 1950s that were built with public tax dollars and that enabled families and particularly children to swim in the sweltering summertime when there was no air conditioning and there were no private pools or backyard pools. And they were an amazing public resource that came crashing to a halt when the court said that Black children needed to be allowed to swim in these pools as well as white children. And so the Oak Park pool in Chicago, Illinois, the largest public pool in the country, was filled with cement rather than let Black children swim with white children in that water. You may have seen a picture of Black children frolicking in a pool, and around the edge of the pool is a white man with a bottle of bleach, and he is pouring the bleach into the side of the pool, into the water, to decontaminate it from the damage being done by the Black children. But her message is hopeful, that if we can find ways to look across the Black-white racial divide, we will find so many things that we both seek and that we could work together to accomplish. So all is not lost. There are some amazing videos. There's a PBS series on race, the power of an illusion. It makes clear that race is not a genetic, biological circumstance, but it is an illusion, and it has enormous power in shaping our views and our actions. Very recently, a new film has come out narrated by Jeffrey Robinson. I would watch anything and everything Jeffrey Robinson does, but this is Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America. It is this 6-week class condensed into a 2-hour video. And numerous churches and community organizations where I live are showing this video and then following with refreshments and tables of conversation that is producing incredible results and breakthroughs in terms of beliefs and feelings. There are some incredible articles, again, the history of the idea of race. The Equal Justice Initiative keeps publishing more books on various aspects of racism in America. The most recent 2 are the transatlantic slave trade and race and the jury. But those earlier 4 books have provided a lot of information that have been foundational to this class material. And then author Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote an article for The Atlantic based back in 2014. You don't have to have a subscription to The Atlantic. You can Google it and read it. It's called The Case for Reparations. And it serves as an excellent starting point for conversations around the concept and the potential reality of reparations for African Americans who have suffered particularly such economic deprivation. So, discussion groups like this, join one, form one, use this series as the foundation for ongoing conversation. Book groups, join one, form one, or if you're in a book group already, suggest one of these books for discussion. Particularly important is the creation and the sustenance and the maintenance of cross-racial relationships, the opportunity for us to talk with one another as fellow human beings who happen to be of different races, to develop an awareness of what we share, of the barriers that exist, and of the actions that are needed to overcome so much of the discrimination that exists. And in those cross-racial dialogues, particularly for white people, to listen and to listen for understanding. I have had so many Black people say to me, it is so frustrating to try to describe a situation of discrimination that I have encountered. And the response I get from the white person is listening to say, I think you're overreacting. I don't think they meant that. I don't think that was it at all. It is important to honor the experiences that people have had and to hear them and to accept it and to move on to discussion from there. It is the natural response of white people when confronted with indications of prejudice or racism to deny it, to deflect it, or to defend against it. And it's important that we listen and absorb and to hear. And hearing, it is really important for white people to speak up, to share what we've learned here. And to speak up, especially when we hear someone make a racist comment. I suspect that all of us have heard those. Some of us may have made those comments at one time or another, and that's okay. But if we've been in those situations where someone makes a racist comment, of course, if it's a family member, that feels especially tough, but in any case, silence means agreement. If someone makes a racist or prejudiced comment and nothing is said to counter that, the presumption is that we agree. Even if we don't, that's the message. I had a boss who said, you know, if you're going to encounter a difficult situation, it's really important that you think about what you're going to do or say out of the heat of the battle. Do you remember that advertisement? I could have had a V8. How many times have we been in circumstances and situations, not clear what to say, and after the fact thought, oh, well, I should have said this, or I should have said that. And so one of the things that we can do is think about it ahead of time, out of the heat of battle. If someone makes a particular comment, we might say, that's not my experience, or I don't agree, or I don't agree with that. Or actually, and then provide a fact. Or, you know, I used to think that, but I learned, or I read, or I saw X, and I found it really informative or helpful. So think about the things that you've heard and be prepared to respond. But in addition to personal growth, we need each of us to take meaningful action. And so one of the things to be done is, the breadth and the depth of the discrimination that exists in our country is enormous. And it is possible to sit back and say, it's too much. It's overwhelming. It'll never change. We'll never fix it. I'm tired. Well, yes, and those confronting it directly have been tired as well. And yet, if each of us says, what one thing really resonates with me? What really matters to me? Is it voting rights? Is it the criminal justice system? Is it police reform, equity in education, affordable housing, environmental justice, reparations? The list is long. If each of us were to pick one and say, I want to work to make things better here, and then to find others who are working in the same arena, to join advocacy groups, seek opportunities to work together, particularly cross-racially, if there are multiracial groups working to address a particular issue, and to make our voices heard. There is also the opportunity to make what has been called personal reparations, to patronize a Black-owned business, a Black-owned restaurant. There are firms that hire what are called returning citizens, people who have been incarcerated and have been returned to the community and are seeking meaningful employment. Find out what organizations, what companies in your community hire these returning citizens and patronize them. Help give those people seeking to return to meaningful life with their family and their community to have meaningful work. And then perhaps there are opportunities in Community United Methodist Church to continue the interactions of this group, of these groups, maybe around particular topic areas, maybe just for continuing discussion, for prayer, for Bible study, but there are ways to work together. Identify these local advocacy groups, just looking quickly by Google. The Innocence Project of Florida seeks to get those unjustly convicted and sentenced to death out of death row. The YWCA across the country seeks to eliminate racism and empower people. The Poor People's Campaign seeks to bring together Black and white poor people in our country to recognize their shared goals and needs. Florida Rising, Thrive Central Florida, the Central Florida Foundation, and the ACLU in Florida. And I'm sure there are many, many more. So what got me off the couch? Because I've known about all of this for years, and I've done a bit of this and a bit of that. But what led me to this? And it began in 2012 with Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Alton Sterling, Stephon Clark, Botham Jean, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Philandro Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Antoine Rose, dear sweet Elijah McClain, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tyree Nichols, and hundreds and thousands more Black people killed by police, generally without consequence. The hopeful piece is that in recent years, the George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery murders resulted in a different consequence. But the issue continues. In closing, Eddie Glaude is a professor of African American Studies. He's the head of that department at Princeton University, and he often speaks on television. And I could listen to him from 8 in the morning till midnight. He is extraordinary. He is an African American man. He is straightforward in his comments. He pulls no punches, but he doesn't elicit that denial, deflecting white person response. When I hear him, I go, oh yeah, it's true. Well, he has written a number of books, most recently one about James Baldwin. And when I saw him on a TV program lately, Eddie Glaude said that Jimmy Baldwin said to him, one of the questions, or the question, that he hated getting from white people the most was when they would say to him, so what is it that Negroes want? And James Baldwin would say, what do you want? You want fairness. You want justice. You want opportunity. You want safety. That's what the Negro wants. So what is our conception of justice? Should some people be valued more than others because of the color of their skin? Black people are dying because of racism, because of violence, because of police action, health inequities, food deserts, poverty, malnutrition, lack of access to health care, stress-related comorbidities, maternal and infant mortality. Is that justice? In October 2018, the Census Bureau created a comprehensive census tract level data set that covers nearly the entire United States population. As a base point, life expectancy is a fundamental indicator of inequality. Researchers focus on life expectancy as the broadest possible dimension of privilege. Where I live, the life expectancy for children born in Centerville, Delaware, exceeds those born in Wilmington near East 12th Street by 18 years, nearly 2 decades. Those two census tracts are less than 6 miles apart. Racism hurts us all. Our country is at risk. We must act. So I ask you to engage in self-examination, continuing education and dialogue, determining what action is needed, and making a personal commitment. And of course, vote.